I come before you with the heaviest of hearts. Unbelievably, overnight, we have lost some of our own in an attack we would never thought we would see here in our city. In the past 24 hours, this city has been shaken by a tragedy that none of us could have ever imagined.
These are good people in Australia, good people, good country. Terrorism should never have happened, obscenity. What do the events of the past few hours tell us and teach us? And is it possible to deal with lone wolf killers who are determined to slaughter innocent people? He writes for the National Review, Daily Telegraph, and many other outlets. Tom Rogan joins us from Washington to discuss. Tom, I think it goes beyond saying that, of course, our prayers and thoughts go to the people of Australia, but there's a debate going on as we speak. There are those who say, look, he was insane, he was a criminal, he dabbled in black magic, he may have claimed to be an Islamist, but this has nothing to do with Islam. How would you react to that?
Well, the very fact of what he says, I mean, if you look at, I looked at his website before it was taken down, and he specifically says, I used to be, something along the lines of, I used to be Rafida, which is a derogatory term for Shia Muslims, and now I've found true Islam. And his association by imagery, by broadcasting the Shahada on the flags and on the headband, suggests that his interpretation of Islam and desire to be a jihadist was a primary motivation.
Mm-hmm. And we should explain some of the images that we see of him. He appears to be a Shia Muslim. He's dressed in a way that is specifically Shia. The conversion is relatively recent. It's not that Shia Islam doesn't have its extremists. Iran, for example, Hezbollah, these are Shia, Shia dominated. But the fundamentalism we see in ISIS and elsewhere is actually anti-Shia and extremely Sunni, which again is not to say that all Sunni Muslims believe it. But the things that he posted on Facebook, the letters that he wrote, his attitudes, his arguments, he's well known to the police and within sort of talk radio and media. They might not have taken him as serious as they should have, but they all assumed he was an Islamist fanatic.
Yes, yes. And I think anyone who says that you don't want to construe this as a problem that is associated with Islamist extremism is delusional, because the intent of ISIS, which is broadcast very clearly, very literally by the videos that they get Western recruits in Iraq and Syria to produce now, calling on their brothers, as they would say it, to join the fight, to join the cause, to join the Islamic State by engaging in acts of lone wolf terrorism, is the specific linkage. We don't know if that was the case here, but we do know that there is a global movement of people who ascribe to the beliefs. And if you ascribe to the beliefs of a particular ideology, in this case, ISIS's brand of Salafi jihadism, and then you carry that through, then you are by definition associated with that. I mean, it's not, you can't just say, oh no, because of whatever political correctness reason, there's a distance there. You have to face up to the honest reality.
Yes, I think we do, and it rather appalls me that we blame mental illness. The vast majority of people with mental health issues are peaceful, and if anything, they're victims rather than perpetrators of violence. And also, extremist groups have long used people with mental health issues. The far right, and even to a degree the far left, but various violent groups have preyed on these people, knowing they're vulnerable. In this case, he wasn't someone who, as obscene as it would be, just began to shoot people who he didn't like. He posted an Islamist flag. He spoke about Islam, that there was some motivation. Now, maybe that was mixed up in a vile stew of mental illness and religiosity, but it's still an enormous contributing factor.
Yes, I mean, again, as I said, his website, his prior statements, the fact he declared himself a sheikh, which is absurd on the face of it. Yeah. I mean, clearly the guy is not a representative of most Muslims around the world, but he is a representative, unfortunately, of the agenda of the Islamic State. They believe that innocent people who do not bow in submission to them are pawns for terror, pawns to drive Western governments away and allow them to dominate the region and then ultimately dominate the world.
Mm-hmm. Now, many of us know relatively little about Australia. It's a long way from most other places, even from New Zealand, for goodness sake. It's a fair distance. There's about 500,000 Muslims in Australia. It's not a huge population anyway. most, of course, law-abiding and good citizens, but there have been a number of issues. There have been anti-Semitic attacks. There have been threats of terror. Australia's been on a fairly high security footing for some time in reaction to some of the threats that have taken place. So this doesn't come in a complete vacuum.
No, it doesn't. I mean, I wrote a piece back in September outlining why, for the National Review, why I was so concerned about the terrorist threat in Australia. One of the key reasons is that an actual Australian individual who some reports suggest is now being killed, hopefully he has been acting as an operations interlocutor for ISIS back to Australian sympathisers. And the arrests that we saw actually back in September of a number of individuals in suspicion of a potential beheading plot, it was linked to him. So there is a operational link that is concerning. And unfortunately as well in Australia, there is quite a loud, again, very small minority, but a loud and aggressive small minority of quite extremist imams who have a lot of disdain both for Australian foreign policy. And so that kind of, all you need is a few people. Of course, I mean, we saw what one person was able to do here, who really didn't, wasn't terribly with it, it seems. But again, it is a major problem. And there are people who want to commit acts of violence, and to pretend that this is not a threat and not a challenge is actual seriously problematic delusion, because again, this is about people's lives and it's about the state of functioning peaceful society in question.
And of course, Canada and Australia, arguably two countries with a leadership that has been most outspoken in criticizing Islamism, in defending the Jewish state in the Middle East, Israel, and so we can understand why they may be targeted. Let's talk about this lone wolf situation, though, because I don't see how it really can be prevented. Now, individuals who are high risk can be targeted by intelligence agencies, but someone who is simply motivated quickly from a position of religious extremism, but a non-violent position, into violence, if he suddenly finds a gun and runs into a store, how can we possibly control people like that?
Well, exactly. And the Islamic State fully knows that, and as does Al-Qaeda core. Interesting, al-Zawahiri, and this hasn't got as much notice recently, back in 2013, called on lone wolves. And as you mentioned, there is an interest by jihadists to get either people who have mental illness or susceptible people. And all it takes, and I just mentioned that I just had a piece out in the last hour mentioning this, is that all it takes is some individual who has access to weaponry and a will to commit harm, and they that enables the transmission of terror, because the amount of media coverage with Twitter, with other social media forms, with 24-hour news coverage, and being able to watch, for example, my research was watching Australian local news via YouTube, means that there's a great opportunity in that for knowledge, but there's also a great opportunity for terrorists to use a limited attack with a limited number of individuals and limited means to create a massive political effect. So that fuels the negative side, and again is another reason why we have to face up to the fact that this is a jihadist threat that has its roots in a particular interpretation of Sunni Islam. And until we face up to that, then we're not going to really be able to begin to deal with the social conditions in which this threat arises.
Exactly. I mean, that's an extremely reasonable way of putting it. I find very little extremism in those who critique radical Islam. I know there are some crazies out there, but they're irrelevant. But whenever we speak out, the reaction is there's a backlash. Be careful, don't be Islamophobic. It's meaningless. Even today, as soon as the attack took place, people were warning of the backlash. Those people who want to take anger out on innocent Muslims are such a small number and are despised by the mass of even conservative society. So we have to have the courage to speak up about this issue, because tragically, I'm sure, I pray I'm wrong, but I'm sure it will happen. Until we're out of time, we'll have you back on the show very quickly, though, because I suspect we'll be discussing this throughout the week. As always, my friend, a great pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.